Our next speaker is Dr. Erick Chastain, who received his BSc in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University and his master's degree in neurobiology and behavior from University of Washington, and his PhD in computer science from Rutgers University in 2017. He's currently working as a postdoc for Nina Pfefferman at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and his current work focuses on the intersection between the theory of computer algorithms, evolution, and Thomistic scholastic philosophy of nature. So he's going to talk to us today about process information, a novel communication theory with applications to evolutionary biology.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about a different kind of information theory. Information theory is very interesting recently in the sciences. It's been applied in physics and in biology and many different areas. So I'm going to introduce to you a new variety that I introduced with a friend in an IEEE journal for information theory. So and try to convince you that it might be worth thinking about for other domains besides the ones that we've applied. First of all, okay, what was the motivation for information theory? It was communication between two different agents that are intelligent. So how do you communicate with an intelligent agent? In our case, we're going to consider the following. How do we communicate internationally, or in the case where we don't share a language? This is a very hard problem. So, for instance, for the astronomers, what about with other intelligent beings? So there are various protocols that astronomy people consider for this, like Linkos and things like this. But anyway, so a lot of this stuff is related. But what do we have to do essentially when we're talking internationally? We have to discover the meaning of their words, right? We don't know what they mean. So this is what we have to do. In information theory, it's considerably easier in the sense that both of the communicators know each other's language. The only wrinkle is that there's some kind of noise. So you'll have to kind of yell over the noise in some sense, and then there's going to be some, maybe you'll misunderstand a word or two, and then you have to reconstruct what is the word that was actually spoken. So that's classical information theory by Shannon. Process information theory is Alice and Bob have different languages, and there's noise. So what can you possibly do there? Well, this is a question. You have to figure out not only what word is used, but also what does it mean. So this is, seems like a pretty hard problem. But and so hard, in fact, that Shannon himself punted on it. Originally, there have been many approaches towards this. This is just kind of like one grain of sand on a mountain of work. And this is our contribution. So the idea, quite simply, is that you have Alice and Bob having different words for the same concepts. Okay? And then there's some kind of generative structure whereby you have a form which generates both of those words, same form. And I'll give you examples in a second for all these terms. And then those two words, they're different, right? It could be dog for Bob and barrel for Alice. They lead to the same concept. Okay. So this is an informal diagram, but I'll show you that there's a mathematical model that you can put on top of this, and I'll allude to it. But the first thing is to note that we assume that there is some kind of intersection between the concepts of Alice and Bob. So they share some kind of world that they're living in that has the same kind of conceptual apparatus. Otherwise, you can't have any kind of overlap in communication. Alice's words point to things in the intersection point between the concepts of Alice and Bob. Same thing for Bob. Then the forms actually generate both of these words of Alice and Bob. So kind of like without this commonality here and without the commonality of the generation of the words, there's really no hope for communication, right? Because the words themselves are different. Okay, so an example would be the form of a dog, which would then be translated as, or generate a word dog in English, or canis in the case of Alice, who speaks Latin. And then there's a concept of dog, which both of them have, which is held in common. So I promised that I would talk about this a little bit more formally. So the way that we do that is we take that very simple diagram that we had before, and we actually put mathematics on it, basically. So there's a great set of mathematics called category theory, which you can just take diagrams and then put variable names on it, and then you can get math from diagrams that are just words that you deal with. So category theory is literally the theory of diagrams, and you can actually do some quite amazing things with it. But the diagram we'll focus on is basically just analogs of these. W is Alice's word, W prime is Bob's word. C is a concept. We're assuming that all the words are generated this way by these sets or objects in a category, F, W, W prime. And in category theory, we actually are able to recover F, W, W prime from W, W prime, and C, and these two functions, FA and FB, which take W to C and W prime to C, respectively. So you're actually able to just look at this lower triangle and then figure out automatically using this branch of mathematics what F, W, W prime should be. So this is all interesting mathematically, but what does it mean? So for communication specifically, it means Bob has to figure out everything that Alice is saying, all the different words or meanings, and has to combine all the information from the entire transcript. Okay, so basically Alice has a bunch of words that she is speaking, and then Bob has to map a sequence of these K-word pairs to concepts using a kind of feedback function, in particular, which tries to figure out whether, W and W prime have a shared concept, C. So do W and W prime point to the same C, particular C, or do they not point to this particular C? Okay, so if they do, then this feedback function tells them, yes, this is the C that W and W prime point to, otherwise not. And there are various constraints on the kinds of algorithms that Bob can use to figure out, indeed, whether this sequence of words leads to their respective concepts. And at the end of the day, using this machinery from category theory, you have to find this set F, W, W prime, which is the forms associated with all of Alice's words. You see, without the use of this feedback function, you can't really figure out what words they have in common, what do those things mean. That's really the meat of this. And then the forms here are mainly just to be able to generate the words of Alice given a particular concept. Just following the diagram. Okay. So it turns out that if you look at this kind of information, which, as you could see there, was actually based on learning, Bob learning what the words are. What do they correspond to as far as the forms, using this kind of feedback function. Well, evolution, and particular different models of evolution, can be used to discover what phenotypes mean in the environment. So, okay, but, in information theory, there are various evolutionary biologists who try to say things like this, and there's been work on this actually saying, well, we're kind of acquiring information about the environment and the capacities in the environment by using evolution, right? So Revoir and Leibler made a model of this based on classical information theory, and they couldn't find a more general framework to capture all of the structure in their model. And we were able to actually use this model to capture the extra structure in theirs. What essentially they were finding out is that, if you assume that phenotypes are words, states of the environment are concepts, and you basically want to find things that have the same fitness, meaning the same thing. This is their claim that we then tried to make a theory around. Essentially, phenotypes that have the same fitness or take the same kinds of energy sources are analogous in some sense. So they have access to the same energy level, kind of like source of energy or the same kind of niche. That's the idea that they were pursuing. So we were actually able to use our generalization of information theory to make that more rigorous. And basically, their model of population genetics and a more traditional model of population genetics actually gives you protocols for acquiring this kind of process information. So the forms in this case are equal fitness classes of phenotypes or environments. Okay, and okay, so this is kind of fun, another fun application of that. So that was that IEEE paper in the TMBMC with my friend Cameron. We actually, I just independently of this submitted recently paper to the a call for frontiers in developmental psychology. A friend of mine asked me, we were talking quite a lot about James Baldwin and the Baldwin effect, and he said, well, they might be interested in this. So I got to thinking about, well, how could I talk about some kind of semantic or meaning acquisition going on in developmental psychology and in the kinds of things that Baldwin was talking about. Specifically, the development of intelligence and how intelligence might have some kind of a guiding effect on evolution. So this is the context for this work. And so I thought that process information might be a good way to apply it. The basic setup is that Bob tries to complete some kind of a game, like the game set, for instance, where you have a bunch of symbols. You don't know what those symbols mean, and you want to combine them in some kind of intelligent way to win the game. I'm being intentionally vague here because time constraints. And Alice presents raw data, such as, for instance, just the pixels on the cards for set. So, there are some white pixels, there are some, colored pixels, there are some, hatch marks, etc. on some of the cards. You have to encode all of that just as raw pixel values. So really what the point of this is, you want to figure out what those pixel values mean. You want to make sure that you identify this is a color, this is a diagonal line, this is a particular filling of a shape, this kind of thing. And if you understand all of that and know how to combine them in an intelligent way, then you're going to do a lot better than if you just treat them as a mass of undifferentiated white and just numbers associated with a rectangular grid, right, on a card, right? So you're going to be a lot more efficient. And so the idea is you're going to be given these pixel values for the cards, and you're going to have to figure out what the symbols mean. You're going to have to make a map from the RGB pixel values to a symbol set, say colors, stripe, fillings, etc. Bob can do this by acquiring process information and acting optimally given that information. So that acting optimally is actually playing set properly. The first part, acquiring process information, is actually going from the RGB pixel values to the symbols. The color red, the hatch mark filling for the diamonds, this kind of thing. Okay, so there was a lot that I had on that previous slide with the diagrams. As you can see, this is pretty general, and I didn't show you any of the computation under the hood for the actual protocols. But the basic idea is that you're trying to use standard algorithms for learning to implement this learning that Bob is supposed to be doing. So, and it can handle things like this as well. So it's quite general. Okay, but how does this relate to evolution? An evolution of various kinds of cognition. Baldwin actually had a nascent notion of this. If one uses some kind of intelligence or awareness or cognition, you can actually, in some sense, move evolution in various directions by, for instance, making it easier to solve a task by acquiring the right representation for the task. In the set case, it would be actually looking at the symbols on the card rather than looking at them as an undifferentiated rectangular grid of numbers. Okay, so if one uses evolution using the Revoir-Leibler or that other population genetics model to solve such a task, such as set, you can show that there's a speed up in solving the task because, for instance, you'd be dealing with the symbol set rather than the set of all rectangular grids of, size 300 by 300 or something, right? 300 by 300, that's a very big number. Imagine that exponentiated. So 2 to the, how many genotypes are there? Some number to the power of 300 times 300. That's huge. If you have just a few symbols, though, maybe 5, 6, something, then that's a much lower power. So this is the idea. If you're learning in that representation space of the symbols, you're going to be able to solve the task very easily. Okay, so as I was saying, it's exponential in the size of the raw data. And this was Baldwin's insight. Part of his insight, though, his development is from child development and developmental psychology, which is really interesting. He actually said that, in effect, what you can do is start with things like plants at a lower level of sensory motor learning, and you can take kind of behaviors that are very, very concrete, such as reaching out for something and grabbing it, putting it in your mouth. So that would be an example. That's something children do 1 to 4 months. And they could like it, the thing that they put in their mouth. They could not like it. And basically that's, if they like it, they'll keep it going. They'll keep on doing that. And it's all basically centered around their own body. Then there are secondary circular reactions where you actually combine those motor habits of reaching or sounds that you make. So you'll combine these things. And now what you'll end up doing in the next stage is things like coordination of those components. So you'll be able to make some kind of diagram of this kind of complex motion leading to a particular outcome. And that's goal-directed behavior. And then basically you can, this is all from Piaget and others, you can build up abstract representations that way, from the most concrete reflexes all the way up to mental representations. So, the basic idea then is that, and this was Baldwin's idea, and then basically I just put math around it. New species develop qualitatively different capacities for reason or the rudiments of consciousness, more or less concrete forms of cognition. At the very top, you end up getting very abstract reason. At the very bottom, you have something very primitive behavioral adaptations. And as long as you have something like the circular reaction in the first species in the chain, which is plants, which actually there is evidence for this that Baldwin found, and there's more from, for instance, Venus flytraps, things like that. They can actually do motor actions of growth that are repeatable, and they do repeat. So you can build up these sequences, kind of transitions from the different sensory motor stages, but you can play them out in evolutionary time rather than in the lifetime of a child, the development of a child. And this was his basic idea, but basically we are able to mathematize this idea and give it a rigorous foundation. And we do this by saying, well, you can make ever more high-level abstractions set the direction of evolution by making it easier to evolve solutions to harder problems. They'll outcompete the neighbors that use the very primitive representation. And you can continue combining representations, making ever more abstract things. And you can, as I said, have qualitative changes in phenotype akin to Piaget's stages of sensory motor child development happening in evolutionary time, if one follows the right trajectory, because, there's, as we were talking about before, contingency. There is quite a lot of randomness, actually, in evolution. Even if everything is increasing in fitness, there's no guarantee that you're going to get that sequence. So it has to be kind of rigged in some sense to get, evolution with population genetics has to be rigged to get any particular outcome. And this has analogs to actually the Scalinatra discussed by St. Thomas. Because you have these kinds of continuous innocuous steps which lead to increases that are qualitative in powers. So differences that are qualitative, but steps that are continuous. Okay. And in fact, just to end on this, so he viewed plants as being at the very bottom. I mean, there were many more layers under that. There were rocks and other things, but plants having the powers of reproduction, nutrition, and growth. And then, you have, according to Aristotle, though it's kind of fanciful, things in between plant and animal, in between. And now you get animals that have the ability to sense, remember, imagine, plan, these kinds of things, like things, dislike things. So they're sentient. And then on top you have, though not the absolute top, because there are other layers in the Scala Natra, you have man, who has, on top of all of those other powers under it, nutrition, growth, reproduction, sentience, also has reason. And so basically, the idea here is that you're adding qualitatively more kinds of abstraction as you go up. And it all kind of, each level up is a perfection of the things under it. So that's the Scala Natra. And so I hope I've convinced you that St. Thomas is relevant to modern evolution.